Assalamu alaikum. This program is like a class in which we teach the manner of studying the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. We have with us our brothers Ayman from the United States, Ilyas, also from the good old USA, and Brother Muhammad from the beautiful country of Egypt. Welcome, brothers.
Wow.
Good to be here. Inshallah, this will be useful and beneficial for all of us. In our last episode, we were talking about the initial stage of the study of Hadith, which was basically the first Islamic century. And the Sahaba in that time memorized the Hadith and were very diligent in learning and teaching orally as well as in written form. And because of their special environment and their diligence, their strong faith, and their commitment, as well as the oral traditions of Arabia, it was an ideal environment for the preservation of Hadith in that first century. Also, we mentioned, for example, in the last episode that some of the Sahaba wrote Hadith, and we actually have those documents in modern collections of Hadith, or the Hadith collections that we have today, Bukhari, Muslim, and the other famous collections. Some of the times the entire document is found in one book. For example, we mentioned last episode about Abdullah bin Amr, and that the Prophet ordered him to write the Hadith, and anything that he heard from the Prophet, he wrote. And he actually passed that down to his grandson, Amr ibn Shu'aib, and that is very much of it is found in Sahih al-Bukhari as well as in other sources of the Hadith of the Prophet. Peace and blessings be upon him. Later, after that century, we come to stage 2. In the end of the first century, the Sahaba were passing away, and the elder of the Tabi'in, the second generation, the second and third centuries, the generation of really the elder and younger of the Tabi'in, as well as the third generation of Islam, that is called the stage of the completion of the preservation or memorization of the Holy Quran. They're totally different situation in that second stage than what we saw in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad and the early companions, the Sahaba, in the first century. First of all, the Ummah was no longer a unity. Now it was a division. Muslims were divided into different sects and groups. Now, an interesting thing is that even though Ummah was divided in the first century, yet all of the sects and divisions accepted that there was such a thing as the Hadith, and there was the Sunnah, and that it was authoritative. There was no group that said, no, we don't follow the Hadith at that time. That wasn't a belief of any of the sects that arose at that time. That's something that came very much later. But what did happen is that different people would sometimes cite Hadith to defend their group or their particular group's belief or practice, and sometimes irreputable people would forge Hadith or claim statements that they had heard and confuse those statements that they had heard from people, confuse them with a Hadith. And so it was no longer the same situation. There were many written documents being circulated as well as oral stories. And a lot of the people who heard them didn't know, of course, none of them knew the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and met him in his lifetime. And some of them knew the Sahaba in their lifetimes, and some of them did not. And therefore, there was a lot of possibility of confusion about the Hadith. And so at this stage, writing down the collections of Hadith and organizing all of the Hadith of the Prophet became very important. And so Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was one of the great leaders of the Muslim Ummah during this stage. And he was a leader from Bani Umayyah, from Quraysh. He was a leader of the Muslim world, and he was a very pious and knowledgeable person himself. And so he realized this danger of chaos, that people are falsely attributing things to the Prophet Muhammad. So he wrote to all the different provinces or areas of the Islamic world, asking them to document whatever hadiths they had in those locations. And so many of the scholars at that time, like Zuhri and Abu Bakr, Abdul Rahman, and others, answered the call of Umar ibn Abdulaziz, writing the hadiths in their areas that the scholars knew, who had met the Sahaba and had conveyed the hadiths from the Sahaba and from the leading scholars of hadith among the second generation, the Tabi'een. So in this century, hadiths were collected in many works, but these works are kind of general works of the hadith. And so there are works that are called Jami', which are very comprehensive works that were written down and published. That means they were written and copied. Back then, you didn't publish a book, you didn't print it. You had other people copy those books, and they would send those copies all over, and then people there would copy those down also. And so many collections of hadith were written down, some of them from written documents written by the Sahaba, and others were the students, the Sahaba would teach their students, and their students would write down the hadith. And so authors of hadith would come, get those collections that they had heard themselves from their teachers or from other people who would narrate to them from their teachers and write them down. So famous collections were the Jami' of Mu'ammar ibn Rashid, Sufyan al-Thawri, one of the famous scholars, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, as well as the Musnaf of Abdul Razak and Hamad ibn Salama. All of them wrote the hadiths of the Prophet and published them in their lifetime. And the most famous work from that time, Muwatta of Imam Malik ibn Anas, who lived in Medina, who narrated the hadith. And his book was the most famous and widely published book in that era. It was famous all over the world in his lifetime. If he was alive today, he would have been a multimillionaire because he would have gotten the royalties of all those books. But in fact, he didn't get any penny out of those books. But Allah reward him a great reward for what he did. Also in this period, people started to criticize people who were narrating hadith which were not authentic. And this is a special discipline in Islam we're going to talk about in later episodes. Ulama heard people saying the hadith and they said, where did you get that hadith? And he said, I got it from so-and-so. Well, I learned from him so-and-so too. And you obviously don't remember it correctly. And so they would find somebody had faulty memory or somebody who actually made up things or they didn't know where they heard it. And so they started to collect this information and say, we know that some people are qualified to narrate the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, other people are not qualified, and this is why they're not qualified to narrate the hadiths. So at that time it became very important to critically examine the hadith. So they became the first naqad or critics of hadith. So they didn't just believe everything that was said, oh, the Prophet Muhammad said or did this. They investigated carefully. We as Muslims should follow in this custom, and we should investigate things. We should research things. We shouldn't just repeat what we hear and accept it in an uncritical way. And they also started searching for hidden defects. They started seeing, oh, somebody claims that they are hearing from a teacher and that their teacher heard it from another teacher, but I know that guy never met this other guy. It's not enough. I said, I heard it from so-and-so. So wait a minute. How did you do that? He died before you were born. Or you were living here in Iraq and he was in Egypt. Did you ever go to Egypt? No. So how did you hear it? Not possible. So they started critically examining these hidden claims in the hadiths. And so at that stage began to be the real science and principles of hadith were studied. And finally, we got to the third stage, which is called Asr al-Tadween, or the era of the actual collection of the hadith in the authoritative collections we know today. That's the third to the middle of the 4th century in Islam. That's the era of the famous writers, Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, and the writers, those collected the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad in famous collections known all over the world. Those hadiths are found in the earlier works. A lot of them were in written form, but they were writing them for their students, and they hadn't been always collected and published widely. Also, the books writing about all of the narrators of hadith, collecting biographical information, who's got good memory, who doesn't, who became senile in his old age and started getting mixed up and forgetting the hadiths, who used to write his hadith, then his books were burnt in a fire, and so he started forgetting because he didn't have a good memory. And so those books started being collected. like Yahya ibn Ma'in and Muhammad ibn Sa'd, Ahmed ibn Hanbal. They started collecting hidden defects and Ullal in the hadith, and also what hadiths were abrogated, nasikh and mansukh. Like one hadith, the Prophet canceled out something he used to tell people. They started collecting all that information and publishing it widely. And so those books were written and published in hundreds or maybe thousands of copies made in the lifetimes of their authors. And so these scholars would not allow anybody to speak about the hadith who was not authoritative scholar. And so the third stage was really the stage of the scientific examination of the hadith. We're going to go to a break and we'll be back shortly, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Peace and Mustafa.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Hadith Principles. Before the break, we're talking about the stages in the study of Hadith principles in Islam. I'd just like to review very shortly what those stages are. First of all, who can remind me what the first stage was?
Stage of the companions.
Yeah, the stage of the companions, the Sahaba. What was the time frame of that? Anybody remember?
100 years?
Pardon?
About 100 years?
Yeah, the first Islamic century of the Hijrah. So then the second stage?
Was
Stage
the
of the
Tabi'in?
Tabi'in.
Yes, and it was a stage, what period?
Second generation.
Second century to the first part of the third century. And this was the completion of the collection of the hadith. And the third level is the tadween. In that era, the most famous works of hadith were published widely in that era. But that was the third to the fourth century. So the famous collections, the famous ones. Who can tell me some famous collections real fast?
Al-Bukhari,
Bukhari,
Tirmidhi.
Muslim. You should know. Every Muslim should know Bukhari, Muslim. We'll talk about them. The 6 canonical books of hadith, but we'll talk about those in another day, inshallah. But these stages each had a relationship with the time. And so people may misunderstand and they think, I had people say, well, Bukhari wrote the Sahih, his collection, 200 years later. So you guys didn't, you lost the hadith, you couldn't remember the hadith. The hadith had been written and recorded and memorized and recorded in books, and books had been published since long before Imam Bukhari was even born. But most of the hadith in Bukhari are found in other books of hadith written before him. But he made his own collection where he was very careful in the standard of authenticity, and he published that collection, and many other scholars published collections full of hadiths. Bukhari never claimed that only the hadith in his book are the authentic ones. And he never said, the hadiths in Imam Muslim or Abu Dawood are not authentic. No, he didn't do that. He just made his own limited collection, and he published that, what he thought was the best thing, the best hadith that would be useful for people at that time, inshallah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sheikh. We talked a little bit before about the qualifications of, accepting a hadith and stuff. And I remember there was a story about, I think it was Imam al-Bukhari, where he traveled a long distance to get a hadith from a man, and he saw that the man, I think he lied to his, or he was tricking one of his animals, I think it was a horse, something. And
Yes.
then he didn't take the hadith from, so sometimes I guess the scholars wouldn't take a hadith from someone if they saw that maybe there was maybe some dishonesty or some kind of something in their character.
They wouldn't take hadith from people, a lot of them would not take hadith from people who, of course, obviously if they were known as a liar or dishonest. If they were known to be very honest and scrupulous in the hadith, but they had some things they disagreed about, sometimes they would take those hadiths. And so some of the imams, like Imam Malik, wouldn't take from anybody who was from Shia. Shia at that time was not a different religion, not a different sect, but it was a group of people who were partisans supporting Ali. And sometimes those people, some of them were known to fabricate hadiths, but many of them were very honest and did not. But Imam Malik wouldn't take any hadiths from them, but Imam Bukhari would take hadiths from them as long as they were known to be scrupulous and honest in the hadith. and he wouldn't take hadiths that were dealing with the political subjects that they were, the controversy was about, like hadith praising Ali, and exaggerating and implying that only he deserved to have the authority in the Muslim world, for example. So they were very critical about those, but they had very high standards for the behavior of people from whom they would take hadith, inshallah.
Dear Sheikh, concerning the criticism of hadith, I remember a case in which the Khalifa Umar ibn Khattab and one of the companions, when he wanted to enter upon him, and he knocked the door 3 times, but Umar did not respond to him. So the companion returned, and when he asked him about his return, he said that, I heard it from the Prophet ﷺ, if you didn't got a permission after 3 times, you should be back. Umar asked him to bring 2 witnesses to support his claim. What does this mean to our topic, the criticism of hadith?
Well, mashallah, the Sahaba were very scrupulous in maintaining the correctness of hadith. Sahaba used to accept the hadith of each other. They didn't always demand 2 witnesses. And that is not a criterion except in certain cases in Islamic Sharia or Islamic law where you need to have witnesses. But if one of the Sahaba heard a hadith and had a doubt about it, they would want to find somebody else who would corroborate that and who would authenticate that. So the Sahaba were scrupulous. Even though all of them were honest, some of them were very knowledgeable and memorized a lot, and others were very wise, and Umar was one of them who was a very great scholar. And so he had a doubt because he had not heard that, and so he had a doubt, and that's why he wanted to seek evidence to prove it. But once he found other people, then of course he accepted the hadith of this person, even though this person was not on the same level as Umar ibn al-Khattab. And so sometimes, as the Prophet said, sometimes a person can convey the hadith or convey the knowledge who maybe isn't on the same level of scholarship as the person who receives it from him. So the person who conveyed it to Umar might not have been the Khalifa, but Umar will still listen to anybody who's honest and truthful about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So we accept the hadith from all the Sahaba, they're all honest. But the Sahaba themselves, for us, authenticated those hadiths and made sure that all of them that we receive from them are authentic, inshallah.
Yes, I have a question, please. Yeah, some scholars, argue of some hadiths of, what they mean, the meaning of some hadiths. Did the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he gave instructions, did he mean to have more than one meaning to some of his instructions?
In verses of the Quran, not only is there more than one meaning, but even more than one recitation, certain words in the Quran that have different meanings, and all of those are authentic. In the hadith, the words that are authentic, in their word and meaning, all of them are correct. Sometimes, some things, there were different stages. So in Islam, some laws were implemented later. And so at a previous stage, they weren't implemented. The knowledge, which is called the nasikh mansukh, abrogation. While other times, it appears to be contradiction. That might be because he was talking to a particular person about a particular situation, and it didn't apply to someone else. And somebody may have conveyed that hadith and not understood the situation. So it's part of the Islamic knowledge to know the context of whatever is said. But the Prophet may have meant specifically, when he said, for example, only pray Asr in Bani Qurayza, he may have specifically meant to people to hurry up, and you understand, those people who understand what I mean, they will hear that and they will hurry. Those who maybe don't understand that and they will follow literally what I say, they will pray before they get there. And so the Prophet may very well have intended both those things, but he approved both of those understandings. And so sometimes the words themselves convey the meaning, even if the Prophet himself didn't know they were going to disagree, he approved their disagreement. And so their disagreement was based on Islamic criteria. And so if 2 scholars disagree based on Islamic criteria, that's acceptable. If somebody says, I have my own meaning, and they have no qualification in Arabic language or in Quran or Hadith, they have no qualification that they should have their own meaning, then we don't follow that. We follow those people who actually have based their understanding on evidence.
Sheikh, I have a question.
Yes, amen.
There's I guess, we're on topic of studying, and there's a phenomenon now among the youth where a lot of them like to refute the scholars. And they just get a little bit of knowledge and maybe study for a year or something, and then what kind of advice do you have for them? They'll maybe say on a book, oh, this scholar had da'if hadith and stuff
Unfortunately, astaghfirullah. Unfortunately, people don't have the adab or the proper characteristics. And we have to respect scholars who have knowledge and have authentic knowledge of Quran and hadith. No scholar is above making mistakes. The scholars, when we say criticize, the scholars of hadith had to look carefully at people convey the hadith. Because what is the guarantee that this hadith is from the Prophet? It's the honesty and character of that person. Now, scholars in other fields, like a scholar today in hadith, the hadith authenticity does not depend on that scholar. Even a person who is not perfect in their Islam and may have some mistakes, I can check out what they say by looking at other sources. So I can show respect. We have to respect them. And so when we see people, they say, for example, don't take from so-and-so, so-and-so. That's because they disagreed with their opinion about some politics. Don't take from them. Oh, this person criticized some event in modern times, political event. So they're telling people, don't take from them. No, you have to take. Some of those people are the ones who have the authentic knowledge. And so in Islam, we take from our scholars and we check authenticity of things whenever we're able, and we verify them. And so every scholar should have sources, and you should be able to verify them. But we don't reject them because they're not perfect, and they may have made some mistake in some aspect, but we still respect them, and we treat them with reverence as conveyors of the knowledge that was revealed by Allah and the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon them. This knowledge is deen. It is part of our faith. We're careful how we receive this knowledge, inshallah. May Allah Almighty preserve and protect our faith through the study of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. May Allah Almighty bless all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.